today I'm hoping to take a walk with you through the food system that we all exist within currently, and our experiences with this food system, specifically over the past 6 to 7 months, and how we can learn from many of the shocks and stressors that have transpired over this time and set forth on a path that includes more resilience to face future shocks and stressors due to our climate crisis. So addressing the weaknesses and vulnerabilities within our current food supply chain and food system is really imperative to ensuring an available, accessible, and stable and equitable food supply. So yes, I am a teacher, so I have goals for the day. So here we go. We'll briefly talk about what the food system is, what its discrete components are, and then more importantly, the dynamic relationships that exist between these components. We're going to go over the big picture of challenges that we're facing locally, nationally, and globally relative to the food system and food security. Then we'll hit some of the major challenges we've faced in this period of COVID-19 pandemic that has resulted in disruptions, shifts, and critical responses to ensure food security. And then we'll talk about resilience. What is food system resilience, and how do communities address this important preparedness in order to withstand shocks and stressors? And finally, we're going to wrap up with an activity. I was just thrilled with the breakout sessions last night. So much great dialogue happened, and I'm hoping that we can take this conversation on food system, food security, and resilience into those breakout sessions. Okay, so here we go. When we talk about the food system, the most logical place to start is to break it out into its most basic components. The pieces that make up the food system that you see right here really identify the supply chain from production through consumption and ultimately waste management. So of course, starting up here, we're talking about our farms and ranches, moving into, and home gardens, of course. And then we have these raw products transformed through processing infrastructure and then distributed on a global scale, on a national scale, and on a local scale. And finally, not finally, but then next it's about where our access points are. And last night we heard quite a bit about the value around farmers markets and that direct to consumer access points. And that's a component of our food system, but there's very many more access points. And certainly when we talk about food security, unique access points for those living in a food insecure set of circumstances. Ultimately, consumption, how we consume our food and the skills that go along with that. And then the important area of waste recovery, which can ultimately feed back into the cycle. Oh, I see when I click on it, Connie, it doesn't allow me. There we go.
There you go.
Okay. So I'm going to keep going, digging into these. What is the food system from pulling out from a perspective, getting a little bit broader lens on the food system, because that first image that I showed you is really just independent components of the food supply chain, but it's much more complex than that. When we start digging in, we realize the dynamic and relational nature of the food system. And it cannot properly be examined as discrete separate components. Rather, these discrete components are part of a larger system intersecting with one another and intersecting with our health, ecological resilience, community self-reliance and self-determination, and economies on all scales. We heard last night from Dr. Lori and Dr. Rob Byron about the critical relation our food system has with health. And in every one of those discrete components, from the farm to the waste stream, it intersects our health and well-being. Okay, again, I've pulled our lens out a little bit further, so bear with me. And I'll share these slides I'm sharing with Connie, so you can look at these more closely when you have more time, because there's a lot of information on these. So pulling back to view the food system through an even wider lens, you start to feel the moving dynamic nature of this system. We can start to see the external drivers. And if you look on this top bar across the top where they are listing some really important internal drivers that are influencing our food system today and have in the past as well. But right now we know that urbanization is a massive influence on our food system as populations migrate to urban centers. What does that mean for food production? Fewer people are engaging in growing food, and there's a lot of consumers that need food. And is there a disconnect that is growing around the knowledge about how food is grown and the skills associated with doing that? We also notice that income growth is a real important external driver. What happens to dietary patterns across the globe as wealth increases in areas? And we know that there certainly is an increase in meat consumption as communities approach middle class across the globe. And then globalization and trade is, we're experiencing substantial changes due to big shifts in trade agreements over the past years. And our farmers here in Montana are absolutely affected by that, and it impacts the entire food supply chain. And I know an area of interest to everyone in this Zoom room is climate change. And how is this impacting production? And conversely, how is our current food system and associated land use changes contributing to greenhouse gas emissions? And how can we shift to a more sustainable food future? To elaborate a little bit more on the climate change focused dynamics that involve the food system, I want to show a systems image that depicts some critical interactions of our food, energy, and water systems. This is a growing area of study, the food, energy, water, climate nexus. And each of these critical life-dependent systems interact with one another and both influence and are influenced by climate change. For example, energy is needed for production, processing, and distribution of food, and substantial agricultural land is used for production of energy as biofuels. Water is critical for agricultural production, and ag production practices influence water quality and the quantity of water resources. So central to this relationship is climate change, and each of the corners of this nexus are critical aspects in the climate change dialogue. So this image is important. This is where we're going to kind of center our conversation today. This is how we relate to the food system at different scales. So the red external circle here represents the global food system. We are all part of this global food system and will continue to be part of it at some level. It relies on large multinational corporations, global trade agreements, and large-scale production. But then we also all have a relationship and intersect with this orange circle here, the large volume one. This is kind of what we consider more at our national level. We've developed an infrastructure of aggregation and distribution that involves coast-to-coast transport and distribution of foods, grocery store chains, that allow us here in Montana to have avocados, oranges, and coffee in the middle of the winter. And frankly, right now, this large volume tier of our food system has really been essential in response to food security crises, and it really essential in terms of getting food to our rural, isolated communities. The strategic partner level, that green level, is more of the values-based food supply chain. So organic production and distribution focused groups, the smaller circles of alliances, natural foods and co-op models. We see smaller scale aggregation distribution networks or values-based aggregation, distribution, and consumer networks at this level. The green, the teal, we'll call it teal scale, is that direct producer to consumer. And this is where people who are engaging in this circle are really able to answer that question, who's your farmer? Because the consumer and the farmer are interacting through that direct to consumer engagement, such as farmers markets, farm stands, CSA programs, and more. We're seeing a lot of growth in this area and a lot of ways that small farms and distributors are pivoting to can maintain that relationship. And finally, at the center of this is our personal or individual scale in this model, where we produce or source our own food through gardening, canning, cooking, hunting, fishing, gathering. It's a real skills-based part of this image. So when we think about the relational aspects of the food system and the ability to have self-determination about how food is produced, processed, and consumed, it's this middle section of this image that I'm hoping that we can kind of spend a bit of time focused on, because this is where that we've identified that having resilience at this community down to individual level is really essential for ongoing food security in the time of crisis and shocks. Finally, in terms of just talking about the food system in general, as we look to a sustainable food future that meets the growing demands of food in a changing climate, we need to ground ourselves around these three pillars of sustainability and collectively create a food system that is socially just, environmentally sound, and that the economic models embedded in this food system are both viable and just. So I'm going to move us now to that second goal at the start of our talk today. Now that we've examined what a food system is, I'd like us to dive into what some of the major challenges that we're facing currently around our food system. Our challenges are many. There's full degree programs, as you heard from Connie in the introduction this morning. There's organizations that are international organizations, agencies, centers, communities, and individuals that are focused solely on this issue of how are we going to create a sustainable food future. I want to share this report with all of you as a resource that I think is critically important for folks to familiarize themselves with. The actual full report is about 500 pages long. Fortunately, there's a summary report that's a fair amount shorter. And this came out the full report came out last August, so August of 2019. And it focuses on the challenges, opportunities, and recommendations for meeting food, land use, and greenhouse gas emission goals in 2050. And it actually proposes a roadmap to address these challenges. Naturally, we're not going to have time to dig into all the elements of this report, but I want to share some highlights of it with you. Okay, so the authors of this World Resources Institute report pose that in order to create a sustainable food future by 2050, there are three gaps that we must address: the food gap, the land gap, and the greenhouse gas mitigation gap. And I'll talk a bit more specifically, a slide attributed to each of these. So in general, the food gap is basically the amount of food that we need to produce by 2050 and how that compares to what was produced in 2010. So 2010 is the baseline of this report and 2050 is the target. The land gap is the difference between the global agricultural land that is required to attain this higher degree of food production. And the greenhouse gas mitigation gap is the difference between the greenhouse gas emissions attributed to the agriculture and land use for agriculture now in 2050. So I'm going to dig into these a bit more. The food gap. It's as I said, the difference between the amount of food produced in 2010 and the amount necessary to meet the demand in 2050. You can see this is being driven mainly by population growth. We estimate to have close to 10 billion people by 2050 with about 7.8 currently. So this is substantial. In addition to that, we're seeing a growing middle class, which puts even more pressure on the food system with different dietary habits and increased consumption. So how are we going to get there? There's not one solution. There's going to be a combination of solutions, including increased yield at rates that they say need to be even faster than those achieved during the Green Revolution, tempering demand, and of course food waste, eliminating food waste being an important factor of that 56% increase in food. The land gap, we need to come up with, if we need to come up with 56% more food, how do we do this without changing our current approach to agricultural production? Oh, without changing our current approach to ag production, we'd need expansion of production land on the massive land the size of 2 Indias. And that's just not possible. So this report actually has so many approaches for efficiency in order to not have to see expansion of agricultural land. In addition, finally, the greenhouse gas mitigation gap. This is what, because we need to close this gap, food gap of 56% while lowering greenhouse gas emissions associated with the food system. Basically reducing our carbon emissions from the food system by 67% in order to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius. If we're trying to attain the 1.5 degrees Celsius, that would require extensive reforestation in addition to many of the components that are proposed in this report, just to keep it below 2 degrees Celsius. So currently, I think the take-home point on this is that currently agricultural production and land use change associated with agriculture, I want to emphasize that point. Agricultural production, or the agricultural system, and land use change associated with agriculture accounts for about 25% of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. It's really important to understand this contribution of land use change, as it accounts for about 12.5% overall. As we as a species have destroyed carbon-rich ecosystems in converting landscapes to ag production. The obvious one that comes to mind is the Brazilian rainforest, with substantial carbon stores and ongoing carbon storage capacity. Yet when this is converted to grazing land, it releases stored carbon and loses its potential as a powerful carbon storage contributor. So here it is in summary. And as I said, I encourage you all to check out this World Resources Institute report. And for our purposes today, I just want us to be able to get our heads around the fact that these are the 3 substantial gaps that we need to address collectively. So let's move into our third area, which is, what have we learned over the last 6 to 7 months about our food system, and specifically our local food system? As challenging as this period has been, the COVID-19 pandemic is bringing to light many aspects of the food system that we know are breaking or already broken. I personally am optimistic that we're going to take what we're learning here and apply our collective action, and I think there's an increased awareness among folks who haven't been paying attention to the food system, that it is a critical time to be paying attention from now into the future. This is a very teachable moment that we're in currently. In the next few slides, I'm going to focus primarily on aspects of the food system that are related to food justice and social justice, and specifically food security. So we have seen the food supply chain disruptions over the last several months. I suspect everybody in this meeting has felt the challenges in the food supply chain in some way. We experienced early on the impact of hoarding as a result of concern or panic, and continue to see the availability of certain items disrupted. This graphic really shows the relationship between where our food system has become most concentrated and where the bottlenecks in the supply chain are occurring. So the larger ovals here are where it's less concentrated. So we know that we have a lot of producers. We still have a wide range of producers across the country and globe. And then of course we have a lot of consumers. But where we see the smaller circles is where there has been concentration across the food system in these areas. And I'll use the processing piece as an example. We know that during COVID, that when a specific meat processing plant was impacted by COVID, that there were massive ripples of disruption across the food system, because that has become so concentrated, and it impacts distribution and access in so many different areas of the nation and globe from one specific processing plant. We also saw huge pivots happening at the manufacturing and distribution levels as demand shifted away from food service toward retail groceries as restaurants closed. We continue to experience a lot of shifts. I mean, there's now a substantial aluminum shortage in the manufacturing sector. But many of these pressures have resulted in magic happening when organizations and businesses came together to address some of the restrictions and shocks that were occurring. Again, I mentioned that we're going to focus here on food justice and social justice issues. Last night, you certainly heard from Dr. Lori and Dr. Rob Byron, the impact, the inequity across health, both globally and down to our community levels. This tough time has really brought to the forefront things that we knew about health disparities, and specifically diet-related disease. Communities of color are experiencing certain disease and conditions at substantially higher levels. And there are so many food system connections to these circumstances, including food availability, access, stability, and utilization. These are not equitable across all communities. This slide from CDC depicts the incidence of type 2 diabetes across different racial groups and ethnicities in the US. It's now becoming quite clear that these same communities are being disproportionately impacted by COVID in terms of both illness and death. Underlying issues of economic, food, and environmental justice are at work here, and these are critically important for us to collectively address. So let's bring ourselves into specific communities that are experiencing diet-related disease, and what puts them, the diet-related disease that puts them at higher risk for poor outcomes should they contract COVID. Here you're going to see what has been a typical scene that has been occurring in many of these communities, and that is the substantial increase in demand for emergency food security outlets. So this top image is the food bank lines. This is from Inglewood, California, but we have been seeing the same demand happening here in Montana in terms of the emergency food security safety net utilization. And I suspect this is not going away anytime soon, as the economic implications of the pandemic are resulting in a higher degree of food insecurity and economic distress. The bottom graphic here, I just wanted to share with you, this was refers to a federal program that was put in place rather quickly to connect farmers and ranchers with the growing emergency food need. So product was aggregated through USDA regions from farms and ranches that actually were stuck with a fair amount of product because of the disrupted supply chains. And they were distributed out through our existing distribution networks. Here in Montana, Cisco has been the major distributor associated with this Farms to Families program. But this is, and then getting these resources out to our extensive food bank network, which Feeding America is the hub of that network nationally. And then we have in Montana, the network of our own centered with the Montana Food Bank Network in Missoula that distributes out to food banks and food pantries across the state. But this Farm to Families program is a temporary program, and it's for long-term solutions, we need systemic solutions. Back to food security. Dr. Lori Byron last evening spoke about the vulnerability of children, both globally and nationally, around food insecurity. This graph is based on just recent surveys that came out in terms of the incidence of food insecurity, specifically among households with children since COVID. We're seeing a substantial vulnerability related to food insecurity among households with children. And this is just not a tenable situation. It must be addressed because we know that there's so much so much that happens in terms of a lifetime of health and engagement and connectivity in society when children are experiencing those circumstances early in life. So we need to strengthen our food system at all levels, across all sectors, to make it more socially, ecologically, and economically sustainable. We need to ensure that we all have a reliable and consistent source of quality food, sufficient resources to produce and purchase food, the knowledge, skills, and infrastructure to choose, prepare, and distribute food, and finally, the long-term stability relative to their sources to access and utilize nutritious and culturally appropriate foods. This is the basis of food security, ensuring that the food is available, people have access to it, this food supply is stable, and that people know how to utilize healthy food. The COVID pandemic has delivered an abrupt food system disruption, and it's my hope that we'll learn, make adjustments, and innovate hard so that we can develop greater resilience at all levels, at the community level, at the state and regional level, national and global levels. We need to be able to recover from food system shocks and disruptions due to our climate crisis, and we know that those shocks and disruptions are imminent and happening already. The left image here is the large snow event that happened in Browning, Montana in February 2018 that closed the entire community off to food access. Food was helicoptered into Browning in order to ensure food security for this community during that time. We see another drought picture here. This one's not from Montana. You can tell because that's corn, isn't it? But we know that extreme drought continues to devastate agricultural communities. And of course, wildfire will continue to be a challenge for us in the West around emergency food security in the communities that are devastated by that, in addition to the agricultural products lost due to wildfire. So while we're not going to find full solutions today, we're going to talk about what the critical resilience assets are that need to be in place that enable communities to bounce back better and faster and avoid devastating food insecurity circumstances. The changes that we need to see in the food system need to be centered around the concept of resilience. Resilience is the ability to prepare for, withstand, and recover from a crisis or disruption. A resilient food system is able to withstand and recover from disruptions in a way that ensures a sufficient supply of acceptable and accessible food for all. The resilience needs to occur at all scales, as I've mentioned, the local, national, and global levels. What I'm hoping what we can ponder today is how to address that community level food system resilience. To date, local governments and communities have few resources available to ensure that food systems are considered a critical component of disaster preparedness and resilience planning. Connecting food security to crisis preparedness is critical in a changing climate, but even better is to create a system that's resilient and can withstand shocks. So when we talk about food security and resilience, the very first place we need to go is to address what assets exist in the community that make it resilient. This term is referred to as resilience capacities, and there's been a fair amount written up about this. For our purposes today, I wanted us to think about what resilience capacity or assets exist in these three categories at the community level. The financial and material assets, such as money and infrastructure, social capital in terms of connections and relationships, because we certainly know that a community is more resilient when it's well connected and working together. And then human capital, what knowledge, practical skills, and education is critical for that community to be able to withstand shocks and stressors. Oh yeah, one more one more image graph. How can we ensure that our communities are set up to be resilient in the face of shocks or longer term stressors? Frankly, we need to be doing all steps that are embedded in this resilience flow image here. And I'm hoping that today that we're focusing on the community level. We need to be learning, building robustness, all while absorbing and reacting to shocks and stressors. In other words, we need to be building this airplane as we're flying it. I wanted to provide some examples of some goals before we go into our breakout sessions so that we can kind of think about what may be some areas of collective action that we can work on that will help to address these resilience capacities or assets at the community level that will create a stronger, more sustainable food system into the future. So there's a lot of work going on in different communities around all of these things, and I would love for everybody in the breakout sessions to share what is going on. But its importance of raising collective awareness around the importance of local food system is critical. I mean, if we're going to be asking our local producers and businesses to be engaging more in that local economy, there needs to be a market and support from the consumer level for that. We're seeing a real loss of practical skills that fortunately there's interest again in this around cooking, gardening, skills that help to make us more resilient and food secure. The network connections, we've talked a lot actually in this during the last night about the importance of strong networks and strong connections as we move forward to address our changing climate. And then the safeguarding food retailer access point diversity. This is so particularly important for rural communities and more isolated communities. The loss of a grocery store in a rural community is devastating and can be the individual tipping point for food insecurity within that community. So how can we ensure that there's multiple access points for resilience in that community? And then we know that Montana has lost a substantial amount of infrastructure within our food system as the food system has become more centralized. What are our priorities for investing in production, processing, and distribution infrastructure to make us more food secure? Closing the food waste loop is one that we need to start paying lots of attention to, and there's great examples of where that is happening in certain communities, but there's lots of room for improvement. In the United States, we saw a little bit about food waste last night. In the United States, our food waste is primarily at the consumer end of the food system. That varies globally. We see in the developing world, food waste is typically more at the production end of the food system because of issues such as lack of labor, lack of storage, lack of refrigeration. So we see more waste at the production end. But here in our culture, in our society, we're seeing that food waste more at the consumer end of the food system. And the amount in the United States right currently is 40% of food is wasted. And finally, policy and planning that supports local food system resilience. There is a fair amount happening around community level climate action plans, and food systems are being embedded in this information. Really critical that we continue to speak up and focus on this. Okay, so now we are going to go to our breakout groups. And here's what I've asked, sent forth to Connie, is that we have discussions on what challenges have been observed during the COVID crisis, what examples of resiliency have occurred during this time, and then what resilience capacity exists or are needed. And finally, where will we all commit to putting our individual or collective capacity to strengthen community level assets for food system resilience.